Okay.
Okay, good.
I'm Jerry Gordon, the senior editor at the New English Review, and we have with us today as a guest Seth Frantzman, along with our colleague General Adams. Seth is the Middle East correspondent, senior Middle East correspondent for the Jerusalem Post, and he's also the Israel correspondent for something called Breaking Defense. He's a fellow New Englander, which is good to know. But he's also, more importantly, the author of several important books. One of them is Drone Wars, Pioneers, Killing Machines, Artificial Intelligence, and the Battle for the Future. And After ISIS, America, Iran, and the Struggle for the Middle East. And as we are speaking today, Seth, more actions are being undertaken by the IAF against, in this case, the Houthi at the port of Hodeidah. But let's get to the reason we wanted to talk to you. John, could you provide us with a prayer for both Sahel and Israel?
Yes, we ask God's blessings upon the Israel Defense Forces, upon the state of Israel, and upon the Jewish people, all of whom have been at war with the enemies of civilization since October 7th, and since for decades before, but as most recently October 7th. So we ask Hashem's blessing on our brothers and sisters in Israel, and especially upon Sahel.
So, Seth, why did you write the October 7th war after only 8 months of the conflict sparked by the Hamas pogrom in southern Israel?
Well, thank you for having me on. The book that I wrote took shape actually within the first month or so of the war. I was down on the Gaza border the first day, and then the second day as it all unfolded, and as the mass massacre and murder became clear. And it was clear that this is a turning point in the region, this war. It's going to be massive, it's large. So I understood that. And I was already kind of taking notes day by day of all the units that were involved and interviewing lots of people. I had a lot of very good access from the very beginning, more access, I think, than any war I'd covered in the past in terms of meeting different units and going down with them as they trained, then as they went into Gaza, getting to go in and things like that. So I knew that I had a lot of material here, and I felt that it would be a shame to let that material just sit. It's easy to take, 100,000 words of notes, actually. It's easier than you think. And then you realize afterward that you don't do as many things as you'd like with it, or you turn it into lots of little pieces, but you don't see the forest for the trees. And I understood that this could be a book. I met with the same publishers that I'd done Drone Wars with, which I think was a very interesting, it was a focus on military technology. But if you look at the 3 books together, After ISIS and Drone Wars and this new one, actually, I think they are in some ways a multi-volume series, because After ISIS is about the decline of the state system in the region and how it was taken over by jihadist extremist groups that kind of, as we know with ISIS, took over Syria and Iraq and threatened the whole region, really. So the states declined. And what came into the decline of the Arab states was, as we know, Iran and Turkey basically filling that vacuum that was left behind by ISIS. And then this very obvious clash that was coming between Iran and America and Israel. So I sketched that out. I mean, I had been on the ground, so it was partly my own story of being there, but I sketched it out. And then in Drone Wars, I talked about the transition of military technology, which was very clear is important in the region and how it underpins the wars. And then October 7th, in my view, is just a whole another chapter, in a sense, of this larger war that's taking place between the West and enemies of the West, enemies of Western civilization, which are, Iran, backed by Russia or China or other countries. So in my sense, October 7th is a shot in that war. And I was lucky enough to have the support from the publisher to go ahead and kind of explore that. And I intended the book to be partly a first-person account and partly a story of the survivors and the fighters. And I wanted it to be similar to a book, if one were to write a book about Pearl Harbor up to the Doolittle raid. So not the whole, you can cover Pearl Harbor without covering the surrender 5 years later, right, or 4 years later. You can cover it from Pearl Harbor to the Doolittle raid as a chapter in history, and then you can cover the whole lead up about how did the Japan Empire of Japan, become so powerful that it could attack Pearl Harbor in the first place. I mean, against a naval power like the United States. So I thought of it like that, or like a book about 9/11, where you look at 9/11 and then you look at the initial invasion of Afghanistan or something, and that's all. Because why would you cover? Why would you cover the whole Afghan war? That deserves to be a whole other book. So that's kind of how I looked at it, and I wanted to write a book that I wanted to read, because I felt that this is such a huge war. It's very hard to understand it by just reading one article that's 800 words again and again. You just do not understand, or it's very hard to understand the breadth of it and all the fronts and all the people involved. I didn't want the book to be a political book, as you see from the introduction. It's not about politics. It's not a judgment of whether or not, Joe Biden or Bibi Netanyahu did this or that. I mean, history will judge that. But I think it is much more about the soldier's tale, which I thought was interesting.
Do you believe that the IDF has achieved the original objectives of destroying Hamas and the PIJ in Gaza?
Well, I think this objectives are complicated in war. If you were to, the way they phrased it here, or the way that there's been a bit of a change in the terminology. So early in the war, the story was in Hebrew even that there won't be Hamas in Gaza. And then it became, as you just said, destroying Hamas, destroying maybe the military and governing capabilities of Hamas, or degrading it, or whatever. Or in some cases, people say, making sure it's no longer a threat. Those are very complicated, generalized terms. And if you fight war like that, let's say you fought the Civil War by saying the US Civil War, by saying, well, we just want to make sure the US South is no longer a threat to the Union, and we want to degrade the capabilities of the Confederacy. Well, you could argue by 1844, the capabilities of the Confederacy were primarily degraded. So therefore, you could just kind of end the war and leave. And obviously, the Confederacy would still exist then. This is not a judgment on whether the Confederacy is similar to Hamas. It's not the comparison I'm trying to make. I'm making a military comparison, which is, if you choose to wage a war in which you're just interested in weakening enemy capabilities, and in my belief is the enemy still controls the field at the end of the battle. And historically, the people that control the field at the end of the battle will generally, if they don't win the war, at least they fight you to some sort of middle ground. So my sense is, yes, Israel has achieved the goal of destroying Hamas's military capabilities, not the governing capabilities. I think Hamas still governs 80% of Gaza, so it's partly destroyed. And look, Hamas as a terrorist organization should never have had military capabilities to begin with. So therefore, the destruction of the capability is something that Israel should never have had to do, because if you look at the reports in Israel on October 8th or 9th, it was said that Hamas has 24 battalions of fighters. That's 30,000 men or so, according to the story. And Islamic Jihad is like a few thousand. It's not as important. Well, Hamas should never have had 24 battalions to begin with. So the fact that it was allowed to grow, and it's now been reduced to back where it was in like 2003. But we know how dangerous it was in 2003. So this is my concern. And I think that if your stated objective is just reducing capabilities, you can check that box. It does not mean you win the war, you defeat the enemy. So I think that's kind of the crossroads we're at this very moment, actually, in Israel.
If I may, go ahead, Jerry.
Did the IDF have intelligence of a possible Hamas attack? And why was it not acted on by senior military echelons?
I mean, from my understanding of this, and again, this is an early book, so there are going to be people that are experts in intelligence, and there's going to be archives and things that will be open in years to come, and eventually we will find out a lot more of that picture. So I can only paint you a very small part of that puzzle, which is that I think, according to reports we have, the IDF had some intelligence about Hamas plans. Hamas had a plan to start a mass invasion of Israel. And Unit 8200 or whatever the intelligence guys got pieces of it, and officers went to their superiors and said, look, this is the plan. And because of the conception in Israel at the time, which was Hamas is deterred, Hamas cannot possibly carry this out, and we're paying Hamas to be kind of nice via, Qatar is paying via Israel to keep them nice. The theory was they couldn't carry it out. So therefore, the pieces of the puzzle were there, but no one really believed it was possible. And Israel had invested $1 million or whatever in a high-tech fence like the Maginot Line, and people didn't take it seriously in terms of its capabilities. They left 500 or 600 combat soldiers to face, 3,000 to 6,000 enemy fighters, which is not, even if you're a very good combat soldier, those are not great odds. So I think the IDF had a lot of the information, but look, the whole story of intelligence work is always about information. You get all sorts of things come in, but how do you know what to choose, what is important, what is it, how to grade it? I think they tried. I think they made obviously serious errors. Hopefully they'll learn from that. It's similar errors were made in 73. I think several similar errors are made every time in history when you find a country is taken by surprise. So unfortunately for Israel, it cost 1,000 lives and 250 hostages, of which more than 100 are still held there.
So what prompted the resignation of the IDF military intelligence director head and the Unit 8200?
Well, I think there's a very strong sense within the IDF that they an admission of failure, and they've taken responsibility. And what they've said, including those people you mentioned, but as well as others, is that we failed and we have to take responsibility. Now, there's also a sense in Israel we're not going to investigate this war until it's over. The IDF is doing its own investigations, but the bigger political investigation is not going to happen, apparently, for a while. And then there's also a sense that you can't replace all the leaders in the midst of the war. Now, as a student of military history, I would say that's incorrect. Obviously, President Lincoln went through lots of commanders, so you can, of course, replace people. But Israel has chosen not to replace them. It feels that wouldn't be good. So there was a sense that people shouldn't all resign immediately because there'd just be no top brass. And I think that's fine. So therefore, what they did is they waited a while, and they're going to resign bit by bit, and they will take responsibility. And they understand that obviously, when it comes to the intelligence aspect, and as well as the division commander on the border of Gaza and probably Southern Command, those people have to take the responsibility for their errors. Hopefully, the question is if they will learn from them and if they will go back and see, what they could have done better, and all of that will come out. So that we'll see what happens.
John, over to you.
How effective was General Goldfuss, the commander of the 98th Division, in developing tactics to discover and destroy Hamas tunnels and combat battalions, given his promotion and reassignment of the 98th for possible ground operations in southern Lebanon?
General Goldfuss is a sort of legend within his own community, and he's very much admired among soldiers. So he came into the battlefield already with a great reputation. And the 98th Division is a very interesting division. It's a division that made up of paratroopers and the commando brigade. So it comes to the field with a lot of experience and some of the best type of fighters and elite types. So it brings with it this kind of elite, it's kind of an elite infantry division with the capabilities you have in the U.S. Army of the Rangers and paratroops and a bunch of other units. It brings a lot of capabilities with it, and commanded by someone who's obviously very capable. And when it went into Gaza, it went in originally to Khan Yunis. So Khan Yunis is the headquarters, not only the Khan Yunis brigade of Hamas, but also it's where Yahya Sinwar is from, the Hamas leader. So it was facing off against the worst of the worst in terms of Hamas had festooned that area with tunnels. Khan Yunis, or rather Yahya Sinwar, is a bit of a Pablo Escobar type of figure in which, he's not just a terrorist. He's more than that. He's a mafia cartel type leader. So, and he's very grounded, I think, in his own community, just like Saddam Hussein, when he was toppled, ran away to Tikrit or whatever, where he was from, because he's basically a clannish tribal warlord. So, we have to understand that what Goldfuss and his men faced there, most of them were men. I guess there are some women that played a role in Gaza much more than in the past as fighters. But anyway, mostly men. They had to go underground, and he fought, I think what he said, a 720-degree war or whatever, where he described kind of fighting, two cones on the top and the bottom. Mm-hmm. It's something that's certainly unique. in terms of going after, hundreds of miles of tunnels. I mean, maybe in his sector it was dozens of miles, but overall we're talking about hundreds. So I don't know if there's a comparison to what the US faced in the Iron Triangle or something in Vietnam where you had lots of tunnels, but it's certainly a unique type of battlefield that has rarely been seen before. And they also had to be more precise in Khan Yunis in terms of civilian casualties, because the IDF was heavily criticized for the first 2 months of the war, where there was a belief that there were too many casualties in the northern part of Gaza, and too much of the city was destroyed. So they had to fight a very precise war, but he brought the right tools for that, because who else would you want than commandos and paratroops if you're going to fight a precise war in an urban environment? So he also was given the 7th Armored Brigade, which is not actually part of the 98th, but he was given it so that they could have some armor capabilities as well. And then they sent Dan Gova's 98th Division all around Gaza to kind of be a firefighting crew to deal with all sorts of other hard cases, like going back into Shujaya and going to find many of the bodies of hostages, and recovery operations, which are the worst kind of operations. I mean, if you know that you're just going to recover corpses. But he did a very good job, and now they've sent them north. And it makes sense, because putting the 98th in the north against Hezbollah provides the other division up there, the 36th, which is an armored division, with exactly the capabilities you want. Because if you have a heavy armored division, back with a lot of artillery and a lot of tanks, and you pair it with paratroopers and the commando brigade, it's just exactly what you would want as a strong fist to go right into southern Lebanon and destroy what's the Hezbollah infrastructure there. And given the experience in Gaza dealing with tunnels, you'd be putting in the right people. I mean, the commandos in Israel have fought an absolutely long, difficult war. I just spent a bit of time with some commando reservists recently, and they've been called up for basically 8 months of the last 12, and these are reservists. I mean, they usually were certain they didn't usually serve that much time. So this has been a difficult war for them, and there's been a big learning curve, and they've done a very good job. And Goldfuss was responsible for that, as well as all his battalion and brigade commanders and people above and below him.
Israel is fighting a six-front war with Iran, its proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, Syrian and Iraqi militias, and now the Houthi rebels in Yemen. What should be Israel's priority targets for effective deterrence?
I mean, that's the million-dollar question. I think is that question of how does Israel get back to deterrence. I think that currently that's not the case. Killing Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon is important, but I think and calling the bluff of Hezbollah in general, of what Israel's done in the last few weeks, of killing dozens of commanders and stuff, showing that it's a bit of a paper tiger. Well, we don't know yet, but it seems at least some of its capabilities have proven to be that. I think when it comes to deterrence, you have to totally destroy an enemy, and in this case, it's like a bunch of them. So I think in Israel, I would argue that Israel should totally destroy one or two of these proxies, and then send around a message that this can never happen again. So, as we mentioned before, discussing the whole issue of whether Hamas is defeated, in my view, Hamas has not been knocked out of the picture, and it should be totally eviscerated and defeated. To send the message that if you kill 1,000 people and more Jews than at any time since the Holocaust, then you will cease to exist as a group, as an organization, as a command structure, as every piece of you. So I would have argued actually they should have eviscerated Hamas a few months ago and then done the knockout blow with Hezbollah. What they've chosen to do is defeat not Hamas like 90% and kind of keep it down. And then they've gone up north to hand Hezbollah. Hezbollah is ostensibly more powerful group, a knockout blow. In order to hand Hezbollah a real knockout blow, you have to go in on the ground. And you have to just totally destroy them. So again, my concern is if we don't see a ground offensive in Lebanon, or a big one, Israel will have reduced the capabilities of two fronts by like 80 or 90%, but it still leaves the boxer in the ring. And I think this is a concern. So therefore, I don't believe Israel can deter the Houthis or the Iraqi militias as easily, because they're quite far from Israel. I also don't believe air power wins wars very well. I know there are a few examples where it did. In Kosovo, they got the Serbs to leave, so it achieved some objectives. And obviously, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ostensibly won the war. But I don't think anyone's talking about using that type of ordnance. So my sense is air power doesn't necessarily deter enemies, and I think history might teach us that. And that's where my concern is. And I think that Israel will have to deal some more heavy blows to these enemies, and hopefully, to totally destroy one of them at least, to send the message. And that's where we're going to have to look in the next year to see if that can happen, or maybe the next few months.
Well, currently, as you know, we're seeing some small scale fighting across the border in Lebanon, north of Adamit, Israeli town of Adamit. A very difficult terrain to fight on, as I'm sure you know. I have personally laid eyes on that terrain. It's tough. But we've seen some small scale fighting there. And the United States, for its part, continues to be concerned about escalation to try to keep the IDF from doing more. Has the United States been, and specifically has the Biden administration been cooperative or obstructive in supplying critical weapons and ammunition and in supporting its ally, Israel?
The question of whether the Biden administration has been, what its overall historic role will be seen in this war, I think it's complicated. I do think the administration on many levels has been supportive in terms of the military-to-military relationships with CENTCOM. I think that works quite well. I think the defense relationship between Yoav Gallant and his counterpart, the Secretary of Defense Austin, I think it works quite well, although we've heard a little bit of clashes about the Hezbollah thing. But I don't think that Biden, at the top level, Biden and the Netanyahu relationship probably works very well. I think they've been supportive, but I think there have been a lot of strange controversies that don't send the right messaging. Now, there was a question of some ordnance that was withheld, but I think that Israel has most of what it needs. I just think that if you tell the Iranians or the proxies that any ordinance is being held up, they're going to think that's great news. If you tell them, well, the U.S. wants a ceasefire, and a lot of the messaging from Washington has been basically pressuring Israel, not pressuring Hezbollah or Hamas, or the backers of Hamas, like Turkey, Qatar, Iran, Russia, whatever. So that's where I think the problem is a lot of the messaging. And I think this is a region where messaging matters. I mean, if you're a Sinwar or Sinwar's backers and the other Hamas members in Doha or what have you, and they hear, that Washington is pressuring a ceasefire, then they think, okay, well, we don't have to give up. We just have to wait. And that's where the problem, I think, is, which is it's not a question of maybe of material goods or whether or not the support is there. America is very supportive of Israel. But I do think this mixed messaging that constantly comes out is always going to feed Israel's enemies, and they feed off of that, and they think, okay, well, we don't have to give up. And that's where I think it sometimes prolongs the war, probably needlessly.
John?
Go ahead. Okay. How important was Israel's? I mean, you commented that you thought the relationship between the IDF and CENTCOM, between the Ministry of Defense and CENTCOM, between the Ministry of Defense and our Department of Defense was largely a good news story. But the question is that I have is, and I know that we the U.S. played a role in if not deterring, in blunting Iran's attack with drones and missiles in April. Was that a good message, or what was the impact of that message?
I think the coordination between that U.S. CENTCOM and Israel and other countries now in the region or in the West, I think the coordination against the Iranian missile threat is certainly a watershed moment, because it's 300 to 500 drones, rockets, and drones, missiles, and ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, which is like a lot. I mean, it's unprecedented, I think. So the coordination is great, and the fact that I think it all worked very well. The only side to it is you have to wonder that some people say, well, the Iranians might say, well, okay, if CENTCOM's not there, then we can do this again. Or, if the U.S. doesn't have an aircraft carrier here in the region, well, maybe we could do this again. So I think there's a concern that it leads to a perception that Israel cannot defend itself by itself, which historically Israel always basically only relied on itself. And I think, that's where the Iranians may start to think, well, okay, the Americans, we need to find a way to get the Americans out of this picture. or get the Americans to tell the Israelis, listen, we're not going to help you next time or something. So that's the only policy question where I think you'd have an issue. But I think in terms of the person-to-person relationships that have formed between individuals in CENTCOM and their counterparts in Israel, the chief of staff level or what have you, or below that, I think that's really been phenomenal, and that's what I've heard. So it's very, very good, and it's only getting better in terms of joint training and joint work and discussions, and after, debriefing or whatever, like what works, what doesn't work. So it seems to all be really working well. I guess it's always going to be a policy question as to what is the policy of the United States and what is the policy of Israel, and do they agree on certain things? I mean, look at we mentioned the airstrikes in Yemen, right? The Americans were supposed to be dealing with this Red Sea issue as well. And I think Operation, or whatever it's called, this Prosperity's Guardian, has not quite gone as planned. So someone will have to go back and look at that and see, America has, for more than 100 years, has fought for freedom of the seas. It shouldn't allow a group like the Houthis to weaken that.
Seth, based on your own experience in Mosul, Iraq during the ISIS war, do you agree with both former British Afghan war commander, retired Colonel Jeremy Kent, and retired Major John Spencer of the West Point Center for Modern Warfare that the IDF has fought a just war against Hamas?
Yes, I think the war against Hamas has been a very mostly just war. I mean, is there any more just cause than the mass? If someone massacres thousands of your people and takes a 250 hostage, you should have a right to go in there and totally destroy the organization that did it and eliminate the people that were involved. In this case, it's thousands of people, unfortunately, in Gaza that were involved in this. And if they're hiding under schools or in schools or UN facilities or under buildings, and they totally exploit the medical infrastructure and everything so cynically, it makes it very, very difficult. And that's why the shame is on the international community for not doing more to make sure Hamas is disentangled from all these NGOs and UN structures. All they've done is allow them to kind of whittle their way in. I think it has been a just war, but it's look, I mean, at the end of the day, wars are not clean. It's not easy. Nothing's perfect. Nothing's the way you'd like it to be. This isn't chivalry with, two knights charging at each other in armor. This is a very difficult conflict. Lots of civilians, I think, have suffered. Some have died. And I'm sure there's all sorts of things that Israel could sometimes have done better against just the worst type of enemy. And I think that, the real just cause is going in and getting the hostages out and making sure that they're all free and not leaving them there, and making sure that this is never done again. And I think sending the message that no organization will try this again.
What do you regard as the most important lessons learned from the October 7th war with Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran proxies?
Well, I think the biggest lesson, obviously, is you should just never underestimate your enemies. I mean, it's you have to always make sure that if you're in a room, then there's a bunch of people, and in terms of top military brass or intelligence people or cabinet level, and everyone says, well, we don't think this enemy is a big deal, and you've got thousands of trained terrorists on your border, someone should raise their hand and say, okay, well, I get it that you guys all think it's not important, but what if they are? What if they are more than a threat than you think? What's the worst case scenario that can happen? And the worst case scenario in this case is not only 1,000 dead and 250 taken hostage, but that the Hamas attack will set in motion the wider Iranian multi-front threat, and that will empower Iran and will lead to a multi-front war. So it's just like what happened that started the First World War with the killing of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. No one thought that this random Archduke being killed would set in motion the Great War, in which huge numbers of people died, right? But it did set it in motion. So now, of course, no one could have prevented that necessarily, but I'm just saying that you never know how something small can set in motion something much larger. I think it would have behooved Israel and the United States and other countries to have been much more wary of this, and hopefully had intelligence services of our allies and friends in the region sharing this information. So that's where we are.
In the time remaining, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. How complicated were those operations to destroy the Hezbollah command and control systems, drone and rocket launch sites, and precision-guided missile production and storage sites?
I think we'll only know how good that operation has gone in a year or two, because the hope is that, you know, half or more of that stuff has been eliminated. But I think we just have to wait and see, because Hezbollah has lots of ordnance, they have lots of munitions, and then they have lots of the more modern munitions that are the precision guided stuff and drones. They have a lot of random old stuff that's left over from decades ago and maybe not so important, but they also have a problem in terms of how to launch it all, because, you know, it's nice to have 100,000 107 millimeter rounds, but if you don't have a way to launch them, who cares? So it's a question, I think, of what's been degraded, and we'll have to learn. I'd have to say I'm always wary of assessments, because in 2021 we were told that Hamas had lost a huge amount of capabilities in that 10-day war, and we learned afterward that actually they hadn't lost very much. So these terrorist groups are very smart and they're very capable, and we should never underestimate them.
In a couple of minutes remaining, what messages did Israel's operation in Gaza and Lebanon in particular send to Hamas, the Arabs in the Middle East, Tehran, and Washington?
Well, I think Israel has sent, you know, a message that Israel will not be deterred. Israel will not stop. It will not buckle to ceasefires. It will not. You cannot use hostages to force Israel to stop. It's just not going to work. And Israel, and even Israel will go against what Western countries tell it to do in order to not just stop the threat, but, you know, really take serious action to retaliate against enemies. And it will go and track down those enemies as wherever it takes. So I think Israel's teaching its enemies that lesson. It's building back deterrence bit by bit. There's more to go, but it's a process. And I think Israel has shown its enemies that you should not underestimate Israel's resolve.
Well, you commented earlier that you talked about deterrence, and I think would agree that deterrence is the object here. That it's not about how much you hurt the enemy, it's about whether the enemy's deterred from attacking you again. What else can Israel do at this point to establish deterrence again?
I think Israel has to completely destroy Hamas and not allow it to continue to control anything in Gaza. I think it should be totally destroyed. It should never be allowed to exist again. If you kill 1,000 people and kidnap 250, you shouldn't be allowed to exist as an organization. I think after destroying Hamas, it would be great to, now that Israel's got the drop on Hezbollah and called their bluff a bit, it would be good to now exploit that advantage as much as possible and hopefully get rid of that group as well, so Israel doesn't have to live in a situation of having these two terrorist armies on two borders that we've all gotten used to. And that would really change the Middle East, and that would be a huge new world if we could get there.
You also mentioned earlier that the United States, it seemed to me you were implying perhaps the United States could do more to take the load off of Israel in terms of getting the sea lanes reestablished. Israel is far away from the Houthis. They've done a good job at attacking the Houthis, but they haven't deterred them. They're still existent. They're still attacking. So how can the United States be helpful in helping Israel reestablish deterrence? What can we do?
I think the United States needs to
in 30 seconds or less.
The United States should get on the same page as the rest of the Western powers and understand that October 7th is not just Hamas against Israel. This is a world war. This is a fight for the new world order in a sense of what we talked about, the new world order in the 1990s. This is a big reset, and it's time for everyone to get together and understand that we have to fight together against Iran and all its proxies, and against, and confront groups like Russia or what have you, and not allow this to happen. So that would be great if the United States could see that wider regional picture and get involved as it can in certain arenas, and then everyone can work together to fight this multi-front war. And I